So Chapter 8, Key Issue 3 is about how boundaries cause problems. And this chapter covers, or this key issue covers a lot of materials. So just keep in mind that we're looking at spatial associations and that all of this key issue has to go back to where are the boundaries between the countries, what type of boundary are they, and how do those boundaries, what do those boundaries mean? So if you just kind of keep coming back to those spatial patterns, it'll make it easier to connect what might seem like a disorganized key issue. So we're going to talk about the types of physical boundaries and the types of cultural boundaries between states. There are 5 basic shapes of states. We'll go over those. And the different regime types, and then the concept of gerrymandering, and 3 ways that it's been done historically. So to start with, a boundary is something that separates a state from its neighbors. A boundary is usually an invisible line that marks the extent of a territory, so you don't usually see the boundary, but it would be marked clearly on maps. Historically, frontiers, which is a zone where there's no state that exercises political control, these frontiers would have separated states, but we don't have many frontiers left. Really, the only frontiers we have would be maybe Antarctica and the Arctic. So there's 3 main types of physical boundaries. So we have physical boundaries and cultural boundaries, and we'll talk about physical boundaries first. If you have a desert in between 2 states, that is a great physical boundary. It's a natural boundary. It separates your states. Deserts are hard to cross, even today, and they're sparsely inhabited, so it makes a great natural physical boundary. And then we have mountain boundaries. So a lot of times if there are 2 different states, a mountain is a great effective boundary between the 2, particularly if the mountains are difficult to cross. Mountains are permanent, and again, few people live in a mountain, or at least up high in the mountains, so they are sparsely inhabited and difficult to cross. So they make really effective physical boundaries. And then we have water boundaries. Water boundaries could be a river, like between the U.S. and Mexico. It can be a lake, like in Mali, and then we have ocean boundaries. So, 2 of the boundaries, the physical boundaries for the U.S. are ocean boundaries, right? The Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. Water boundaries can sometimes lead to conflicts. So, like the Rio Grande River between the U.S. and Mexico, it moves over time, and so that can cause some tensions or conflicts. And here you see a lake boundary. We also have cultural boundaries, and so one type is a geometric boundary. A geometric boundary are when you use a map to create a cultural boundary between 2 states, usually a straight line. So, for example, it's a straight line along the 49th north latitude that separates the U.S. and Canada. Canada is a cultural boundary. It's a geometric boundary. That boundary was established in 1846 between the U.S. and Great Britain, and it was just a line drawn on a map. When you look on a map and you don't see any kind of physical boundary and you don't see a geometric boundary, the boundary between the 2 states might be an ethnic boundary. And so these boundaries can coincide with differences in ethnicity, particularly those of language and religion. So language differences would have influenced the demarcation or the creation of the boundaries between England, France, Portugal, and Spain before the 19th century in Europe. And I know that I said England because England before the 19th century was the name of the country, but today it's the UK. The shapes of states. So once you have boundaries established, you have some different shapes of states, and we'll go over what the different types are. The shape of a state controls how long its boundaries are with other states, and so it affects the potential for communication and conflict. It also can impact trade and tourism. The shape is really a part of a country's unique identity, even if you don't think of it often. It could influence how easy it is to administer governmental practices, and it can affect how unified the people of your country are. So there are 5 basic shapes. The first one is compact. A compact state is a small state. The distance from the center to any boundary on the side does not vary significantly. It's not perfectly symmetrical, but it's small, and it's about the same amount to every side as it is every other side from the middle. Ideally, you would have a circle-shaped state with a capital in the center, but there are no circle-shaped states. But it's really easy to communicate. It's easy to administer because it's small and it's easy to communicate across it. It doesn't take long to travel across. Number 2 is the elongated state. The elongated states, because they are long and narrow, they have the potential for isolation. This potential for isolation means that you can have poor internal communication. So like Chile is one. It's 4,000 kilometers long, north and south, but it's rarely more than 150 kilometers wide from east to west. And so what you have is you have trouble communicating from the north to the south of a state like that, particularly before we had, telephones and the internet. And then we have prorupted states. And prorupted states are disrupted for access usually. So a prorupted state is a state that would be usually compact, but it has a large projecting extension. And the proruptions are created for 2 principal reasons. Primarily, it's to provide a state with access to a resource such as water. So if you would be otherwise landlocked, sometimes corruption is designed when you establish a state. They might give you access to the ocean or a lake or a river. This allows you to have water for obviously human consumption, industrial use, agricultural irrigation, which is super important. It also gives you access to trade routes. Also, if you don't have a major set of water for yourself in a country, you're going to be beholden to whatever country controls the water. So it's also important for geopolitical relations for every state to have access to water. And then we have perforated states like South Africa. South Africa completely surrounds another one. So the state that's in the middle is dependent on the surrounding state for interactions beyond its border. So we have South Africa that surrounds basically Lesotho and mostly Swaziland as well. Another example is the Vatican City that's surrounded by Italy. And then we have fragmented states. So fragmented states involve several discontinuous pieces of territory. So you have states that are fragmented by water, like island nations, and you have states that are fragmented by intervening states. And just here's some kind of overall perfect examples of it. So Cambodia is a compact state. So if you put a city here in the middle, it would be close to equidistant from all parts. Thailand is prorupted. Do you see how the state comes out like this? It's a compact state with like a weird little tail. And it looks like an upside down. Well, it looks like a badly drawn P, I guess. Elongated states, Chile or Vietnam, right? A long, narrow state. It's be difficult to communicate from here to here. Perforated, here's South Africa, here's Lesotho. Lesotho is dependent on South Africa for all of its needs. And then you have a fragmented state, like in the Philippines. You see all the little tiny islands interrupted by water, but one unified state, and fragmented states are sometimes difficult to control. So why do these boundaries cause problems? Think about the different types of government that controls these states. So you could have a democracy. In a democracy, citizens can elect leaders and citizens can run for office. An autocracy is a country that is run according to the interests of the ruler rather than the people. And an anocracy is a country that is not fully democratic or fully autocratic, but kind of a mix of the two. If you look at this map worldwide, you can see where we have autocratic nations. That's the bluish-purple. You can see that we have autocratic, which are mixes between an autocracy and a democracy. And then you have the green, which are somewhat democratic. And then you have the dark green, which are fully democratic. And then you have a few red ones that are failed states. So like Somalia and Libya. If you look at the national scale for the regime types, in a democracy, when people are selecting their leader, they have institutions and procedures so citizens can express effective preferences about alternative policies and leaders. That's why things like voting rights are really important in democracy. Those are part of the procedure that lets our citizens exercise their right to vote. It's at the heart of what it means to be a democracy. Autocracies have leaders that are selected along clearly defined, usually hereditary rules of succession, and those lines come from the political elite. They don't come from the people. As far as citizen participation, democracies have institutionalized constraints on the exercise of power by the executive. So in a democracy, the head of state has limits to their power, clearly defined limits, and usually a system of checks and balances. And this goes for every branch of the government. There are clearly defined limits. Another hallmark of a democracy. In autocracies, the citizens' participation is restricted or suppressed. And democracies have a system of checks and balances. The system of checks and balances guarantees civil liberties to all citizens. Autocracies have leaders who exercise power, but they have no meaningful checks from legislative, judicial, or civil society institutions. So in an autocracy, your leader wouldn't fear the courts, wouldn't respect the courts, wouldn't respect the state representatives or the Senate, and wouldn't fear civil liberties groups. In general, the world has become more democratic since the turn of the 19th century, even when there's setbacks, like during World War II, or recent setbacks with Venezuela or Russia. But you can see that while there was a quick spike in autocracies, right, after World War II, it kind of collapsed and democracies were on the rise. And you can see another spike in autocracies right here during World War II. This would be the Cold War. This would be World War II. But in general, democracies went from being virtually non-existent, right, to being the majority of governments. Now, within the United States, and other countries have the same problem. So Canada has similar problems, and any country that votes does. But we're going to talk about the electoral boundaries. So the boundaries that separate legislative districts in the U.S. Are redrawn periodically to ensure that each has about the same population. The United States, we have ours drawn every 10 years following the Census Bureau once they publish the official population figures. The U.S. has the state representatives for each state draw the boundaries, which is weird. Many other democratic states have an independent board that does it, but we leave it to our elected state officials. And many people believe that leaving it to these elected state officials has led to an increase in something called gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is when you redraw legislative boundaries for the purpose of benefiting the party that is in power. So, for example, whether you were a Democrat or Republican, when it came time to redraw the boundaries, you would want to make sure that your political party had as much power as possible. And so you might manipulate those boundaries so that the votes are not distributed really equally. And so when you have gerrymandering in place, one party might not receive a clear majority of votes, but would get an overwhelming majority of representatives. Gerrymandering takes three main forms. Wasted vote means that you're spreading the opposition supporters across many districts, but in the minority. Excess vote is when you give oppositions a few districts, but you kind of draw the rest so they don't win. And then stacked vote links distant areas of like-minded voters through weird-shaped boundaries. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that gerrymandering was illegal in 1985, but it didn't require the dismantling of existing oddly shaped districts. And even though it was ruled as illegal in 1985, it is often hard to prove that you're doing it with the intent of stacking the vote or wasting a vote. And so it still happens on a regular basis. And not just in the United States. So here, the first one we have is wasted vote. So you see how like one district is red here, right? And the other ones are all blue. And these boundaries were established. They look clean, right? Like nice straight lines, not super weird shapes, an even number of people. But these boundaries were drawn so there was a minority of red voters in this area. So you see the blue voters and then the red voters. And this minority of red voters means that this state, let's say, would have come out with the blue party ahead and the red party with only one representative. And so it would have looked like the people of the state preferred 4-1 the red party.